2021. Call to order. First item on our agenda is prayer, followed by the pledge of allegiance. Please stand with me as we pray the Lord's Prayer together and remain standing for the pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. On earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, power, and glory forever. Remain standing for the pledge of allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next item is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes? All right, the agenda is before you. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Do I have a second?
I second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please say aye. Motion carries unanimously. Agenda is approved. And now we get to the agenda itself. Up here. And I will turn the budget work session over to our CFO. She'll walk us through this document.
Good evening. So tonight is our first budget work session for the FY22 budget.
Thank you. Tonight, we will be discussing the general fund. As we move through the process, we'll include all of the other funds next time. So on the first slide, it's just a few highlights that we'll talk about in more detail as we go through. Our net M&O digest is an anticipated increase of between 5 and 8%. Tommy Knight, our tax assessor, he will be able to give me a more definite number at the end of April once all of the exemptions have been processed. So right now, this budget is based on a 5% increase in the digest and with keeping the millage rate the same at 19.278. Our QBE, our Quality Basic Education funding from the state, we are at $12.6 million for next year, which is about a $624,000 increase from the midterm of this year. And there, in the QBE, there is a 4% reduction, austerity cut, and that for us is about $481,000. For expenditures, our operating expenditures decreased about 1.8% overall, and this is mainly due to the Chromebooks that we purchased from the Facebook grant, and so that was a large part of our operating expenditures this year that we won't have next year. Salary and benefits increased about 5.2%. That is mainly due to step increases as well as the removal of the furlough days that were included in the general fund budget in this current year. The TRS employer contribution rate, which is the retirement plan, will increase from 19.06% to 19.81%. And just a few other notes. Yes.
Any board member have any questions on the first slide there?
Well, where is this slide?
It's part of the agenda. If you
Click
click
on the attachment.
where you see the budget meeting right before the, that's everyone's head on your screen. Okay, it should,
So it's not under the budget meeting?
yes, it's something.
Under the budget meeting. And then there's an attachment.
You have to log into your account.
Yes.
To see it.
There.
Once you log into your account, it's 4:15.
Okay.
You see it now?
It's attached to the approval of agenda. Right. Okay, okay.
You see it?
Thank you.
I think.
Yes.
I do have a question.
Sure.
It says millage rate remains at 19.278.
Yes.
That's right, tentatively, that's going to be the recommendation for this.
So currently, that is the way this budget is built, and the suggestion would be to keep it the same because of the large austerity reduction by the state still. Until they can replenish our QBE revenue to the current state, then I wouldn't recommend lowering the millage rate. Now, we have that option once we get the final digest. It could come in higher than 5%, we can look at it at that time.
Should we remain the same, or we're going to have public hearings?
Yes. So even though we don't change the millage rate, it would still, if our tax digest increases, it would still be considered a tax increase. So yes, we would have to have the 3 hearings. You're welcome. Okay, on the next page, just a few reminders about the 2021 budget. We balanced the budget using about $1 million of reserves. During this year, we've been able to cut costs and make adjustments, primarily due to the increase in our QBE funding. You'll get some more information about the midterm adjustment tonight, which will show this. But we should end this year without having to use any of that unrestricted fund balance that we originally planned. The FY22 budget process followed a similar pattern as last year. We included a 0 beginning line item budget, so each school and department built a budget from a 0 starting point. During this process this year, we've been able to close any shortfalls and would have a balanced budget if it wasn't for the 4% austerity cut from the state. So our plan is to use the American Rescue Plan funding that we've received, which is the 3rd federal funding piece. We've had CARES 1, CARES 2, and now this is called the American Rescue Plan. And we'll use that to fund the shortfall. That will be about $405,000 estimated right now. So the next slide is just more detail about the revenue that we'll talk a little bit more. If you look at the first line is the ad valorem tax, and you can see where there's a 5% increase noted there. The next slide has a tax digest and levy history, and it kind of goes into detail of the last 5 years of where our tax digest has been and where we are now. So we've increased in 2018 from a $222 million digest to about a $276 million digest. We've also gone from a millage rate of 17.144 to 19.278. But for the current year, we are showing a 5% increase estimated for the digest. And we can go back to one more. There you go. And then only other revenue changes in other local revenue. The reason for that decrease is this year we had the Walton Healthcare grant for the $53,000. So we won't have that next year. So that is the reason for that decrease for there. Next, at the bottom is the state revenue, and this is all of our state awards as well as all of the QBE funding. And if you go to the 3rd slide, which is kind of an analysis of the QBE, go back forward, yes, one more. Okay, so the state has not released our FY22 allotment sheets that you're used to seeing, but what this is just an analysis of the last 5 years. And it has each of the categories where we receive QBE funding. And if you'll look, the first line has $180,000 in increased QBE funding, and this is primarily from the increase in our FTE. We've gone from 1701 to 1768. Also, our equalization funding increased by about $397,000. And that's basically all of the tax digests in the state, and they use that as a basis to equalize so that all districts receive the same amount of funding. So that is the reason for that increase. So if you look, we have about a $624,000 increase in our QBE this year. And at the bottom, you'll see what that means per FTE is about an increase of $353 per FTE. So we're definitely headed in the right direction. Are there any questions? I think on the state revenue, if you go back a couple slides To the state, yes, here. We anticipate most of our CTAE grants will remain the same. We did have a safety grant in 2021, but that ends at the end of this year, so we won't have that funding next year. And we do anticipate the bus allotment to continue next year. So those are the main changes there. Are there any questions about the revenue piece for the general fund? Yes? I'm sorry?
1 million taxes, how much is that?
1 mil?
How much?
Oh, how much is 1 mil? Oh, for us, I'm sorry. It's about 180,000. Yes. And it's generally been pretty consistent the last few years. Last year was probably our biggest increase because we had about a 9.3% increase in our digest. So there was a slight increase last year in that value. So it is going up. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll move on to expenditures right here. And the first slide is on salary and benefits. So we will see about a 5.2% increase in salaries and benefits. This slide is pretty summarized at this point. We're still working on finalizing a lot of the numbers. So in the next meeting, we'll have more numbers for you that are more categorized by function, instructional, people services, etc. But most of the increase is due to we are adding new employees. And I want to point out that, like I said, we're going to balance the budget with a combination of our general fund as well as the American Rescue Plan. Some of these positions will be funded as part of the American Rescue Plan. For instance, our social worker, we're adding a district-wide social worker. That is an allowable expense that can be funded out of the new ARP funding. So we will plan to use that for that. The lead nurse. Currently, we have a contracted nurse and a clinic aide at the middle high school. We're going to be replacing that with a full-time lead nurse who is an RN, correct? Who is an RN, and she will be our district-wide lead nurse, so she'll also work with the other schools in the district. We are adding 4 teachers, and I want to point out that these 4 teachers are fully funded in our QBE, so we earned 4 additional teachers through our funding. All of our teacher positions are now fully funded in our QBE, so that's a great point to be at. So these positions were funded this year. And then we have a position of payroll benefits officer. Currently right now, we're working on what that might look like, but it's just a position that helps multiple areas, HR, finance, and school nutrition with the payroll benefits piece. The main also change is the reduction of furlough days. If you remember in last year's budget, we had about a $370,000 offset for the 5 furlough days. We did give back 3, but the general fund still shows that savings. We funded it at the CARES. So that's the reason for the increase here. And then the other increase reason is the TRS employer contributions did increase slightly from 19.08 to 19.8. Are there any questions there on the salary and benefits piece? Next, we have an analysis of all of the operating expenses. And what you'll see is all of our functional categories, like instructional, pupil services, and within those, the line items for each category. And we'll just touch on a few. Instructional, if you look, it says it goes down 191%, and I just want to make sure you understand that's for the Chromebooks. The Chromebooks were included in expendable equipment, so we won't have that this year. If you take that out, we do have a slight increase in instructional category, mainly due to we've been funding our subs out of CARES because most of our subs were required for quarantine issues, so that would slightly increase. Operating supplies, we cut a lot of things from the school budgets last year that we're able to reinstate this year. Under pupil services, the largest decrease is in operating supplies, and that once again is from the Walton Healthcare Grant. We were able to purchase a lot of clinic supplies with that grant this year that we won't have next year. Under professional development, that did increase 106%. Last year we actually cut most professional development. Travel was not allowed, and a lot of things have been canceled, so we are restoring funds back for professional development. We do have plans in all of the CARES and American Rescue Plan funding for some additional professional development as well. So we've definitely captured that. Next category is media services, and there's no real change there. General administration, there's a slight increase there, and this is where, if you remember last year, I put $75,000 in a contingency for those unknowns that happened throughout the year, and that was very useful this year. So that's, again, where that amount is. It is shown under other expenditures in the general admin category. School administration, the reason for the decrease there is just a slight decrease, and it's mainly for reallocating some of the professional development that should be have been included in that area instead of school administration last year. Next page is business services, and there's an increase about $7,500 there. What we have done there is, due to COVID, we've learned that we need to electronically process a lot of what we do, and so we've been able to contract to have an electronic onboarding that we're in the process of working on. Deborah Didier, the HR director, is working with Clear Concepts to roll that out. So we'll be able to onboard all new employees without them having to come in, and it'll all be electronic, and it'll actually talk with our financial system as well. So we've also enhanced some of our E-Tree services, which is where employees are able to see paychecks and submit tax forms, and it just makes the process a lot easier for teachers who are not able to get into the office. Next, under facilities, once again, the only main decrease there is under expendable equipment, and that is from the Walton Healthcare Grant. With that grant, we were able to provide water bottle fillers, hands-free water bottle fillers in all of our schools to replace some of the water fountains. So we had that expense this year that we won't have next year. We've actually been able to replace almost all of them now. We're in the process of finalizing that. I think they're going to do some over spring break with those fundings. Transportation, we have no real increase there. And on the last page, yes.
Is fuel cost and energy, is that what that's?
I'm sorry?
Fuel cost, is that?
That is fuel cost for transportation. Yes, it is included in energy. Yes. And what we found is, probably from some of the virtual days we've had, the budget is sufficient for what we need for next year as well. So that's why there's no real increase in that category. On the last page is kind of a summary, and if you look down near the bottom, you'll see total revenues over under expenditures. And in that first column, you'll see that negative $403,000. And that is the amount I would recommend that we use the American Rescue Plan to fund to close that gap. So in the final budget that you approve, that amount will actually be zero. We'll actually pull out the expenses that we're going to fund out of the federal funding and put it in that fund. But I wanted to make sure you get a clear picture of what we would normally have in the general fund. If it wasn't for that cut that the state is giving us of about $480,000, we wouldn't have to fund anything out of the rescue fund. But because of that, we're going to do that. And we're just now getting guidance from the state about what are allowable costs and what aren't allowable costs. So we'll better know which expenses to pull out of this budget and put in that budget. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions?
On this current year budget, 21.
Mm-hmm.
My recollection, I think it's in here, we had originally projected we would be underwater a little over $1 million.
Yes.
But as it turns out, after chair, this, that, and the other thing, we're only having to pull roughly $300,000.
Yes, and I'll point out tonight, in the regular meeting, you'll approve the amended budget, and I'll point out that this negative $300,000 is honestly not from unrestricted fund balance. This is the Facebook proceeds. We received the Facebook revenue in 2020. We didn't spend it till 2021. So this is pulling out of restricted fund balance. We actually are not pulling out of anything out of our unrestricted fund balance. It all goes together, it's one number, but it's strictly from the revenue that was received in the prior year. Are there any other questions? And I will also point out the transfers, what this is, we have joined the consolidation of funds. Dr. Hoover is our federal program director, and so we have consolidated our funds. And what that allows us to do is take our Title I funds and consolidate them and have more leeway on how we can spend those funds, have more say in how we can spend those funds. So we actually had to set up a new fund. And so it's Fund 150 is the state uses as the consolidated fund. And so you actually have to show up what we would normally have had as expenses in general fund, we now show in that consolidated fund, so we have to show a transfer. And so that's the reason for the $100,000 increase there. It's mainly because we've joined this program for the consolidation. Any other questions? On the last page is just, I believe Carrie not long ago sent you the updated calendar for the budget. And so this is just another screenshot of that. But what will happen next is, this is our first budget work session. And as I pointed out, I should have final tax digest numbers near the end of the month. So we'll want to have another budget work session that will finalize a lot of this general fund, answer any questions that have come up in the next couple weeks, and we've thought about having a virtual session so that we can answer any questions, provide the final feedback we get regarding the digest, any changes from the state. We'll have the final guidance from the state on the federal funds, and we'll know what expenses we can pay out of those to give you a better idea of where we are. We'll also have your SPLOST budget and the school food nutrition budget at that time. Yes.
On the next steps, one thing I noticed is we voted to move our July 8th meeting to July 15th.
Okay.
Do you think that we would have a public meeting?
No, we'll move it to the 15th as well. Yes, so we'll update that. Karen may have already updated it, I just may not have done it on my side. Yes, so we'll move that as well. Anything else I can answer? Provide?
Any board member have any questions of Mr. Strong? There's no vote, no, I agree.
Yep. Just a work session.
If you have questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to Dr. Mrs. Cross and
Yes.
get answers. I thought this was a very user-friendly.
Good, good. And yes, as soon as, you have some time to digest it, look it over, ask any questions, feel free to send them to Dr. Booker, and we'll get back and we'll know how to answer those for our next work session and have any other information that helps answer any questions provided for next one.
One last question. It's probable Social Circle is going to be part of the Joint Development Authority
Yes.
as of roughly June 1st.
Okay.
The school, my understanding, goes the way it's trending. Based on our millage rate, we'll get a nice cut.
Okay.
Does that factor into this in any way whatsoever?
It would. Once, JDA should be able to provide, and they probably would be able to provide some estimates of the anticipated revenue that we would receive. So yes, I mean, if I have no idea, I haven't heard anything about it, so yes, anything that we can have with that would definitely impact our budget.
It would be nice to know that and know that we might have public hearings if there's so much that we didn't have.
Yes.
We will roll back.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. If we have additional funds, that would be wonderful. Yes, so any information you get, let me know.
Thank you for your presentation. Just wanted to share with you guys, our chairman spoke about the JDA percentage that we may receive. That happens June, if it comes to fruition, it would take place June 1st or sometime during that time period. So by July meeting, we will have more definite information. Go ahead.
And what I can say about that is, we plan to adopt our budget before the end of the fiscal year, so in June. And we don't set our millage until after July, August. So if we adopt our budget, but we find out that we have additional revenue that we didn't anticipate, we can always reflect that through a reduced millage rate. So you always have that option, even after we adopt the budget, to reduce your millage rate.
Ms. Cross, did you, the question from Mr. O'Connor, could the extra money be placed in surplus?
Yes. So at any time, yes, you can put money in surplus, yes. And there's basically a lot of times what you can do is actually have that reserved for fund balance. And you're actually reserving a portion of your fund balance for savings. That's definitely always an option.
I was thinking with plans for the schools.
Yeah, and building that fund balance, I think we've all seen since COVID. Having a sufficient fund balance could have prevented furlough days, could have prevented some of the cuts that we had to make. So it's very important to have sufficient fund balance. We are very dependent on state funding, and we've seen that as well. At any time when their funds are cut, we're the first one they cut. Education is the first one cut. So it's very important that we build a sufficient fund balance. Yes.
Any other questions from the board? Thank you, Ms. Cross.
Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Have a second?
I second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say aye. Motion to adjourn carries unanimously. This meeting is adjourned.